The grand house of Maestro Edward von Gartner was a temple to sound. It wasn't just the music that filled its high-ceilinged rooms during his famous soirees. It was the rustle of silk gowns, the clink of fine crystal, and the low hum of conversation from Vienna's most important people. For the maestro, music was a noble language, spoken only by those born to understand it. He was its fierce protector, a man with a permanent frown etched between his brows and a temper as sharp as a violin's E-string. In the shadowed back corridors and servant stairs of this temple, a different kind of life moved quietly. This was Elena's world. She was 16, with eyes that seemed to watch everything and a voice rarely used above a whisper. Her mother was the housekeeper, a woman whose hands were always slightly red from work, but whose back was always straight with a quiet pride. Their world was one of polishing silver until it blinded you, of beating dust from rich carpets, and of knowing your place. That place, for Elena, was often in the grand salon. Her favorite chore, and her secret torment, was tending to the instruments. There was a harp that stood like a golden skeleton in the corner. A cello rested in its case, its wood glowing like warm honey, and in the center of it all, dominating the room, was the maestro's prized possession, a grand piano. Its black lacquer was a mirror to the room, and its ivory keys were a forbidden path to another world. She was never to touch them. This was the first and most important rule. Dust around them, Liebling not on them. Her mother would whisper, her voice tense. They are not for us, but how could she not? The music was in the air she breathed. It seeped under the door of the music room during the maestro's lessons with his wealthy, often bored, students. She heard the clumsy scales, the fumbled concertos, and sometimes, when the maestro himself played late at night, the breathtaking beauty that made her stop in the hallway, a cleaning rag frozen in her hand. Her heart aching. Her own instrument was hidden under her narrow bed in the small, clean room she shared with her mother. It was a violin, old and battered, its varnish worn away in places from generations of use. Her mother had bought it from a pawnshop years ago, paying for it with months of saved wages. It was not a gift for a birthday, but a gift for a soul. You have it in you, her mother had said simply, pressing the case into her hands. But you must be careful. The maestro, he would not understand. So Elena practiced in secret. Late at night, when the big house was asleep, she would lift the violin to her chin. She couldn't use the bow properly for fear of the sound, so she practiced fingering the notes on the silent strings, her left hand dancing over the fingerboard, building strength and memory. On afternoons when the maestro was out, she would sometimes dare to draw the bow, playing melodies so softly they were barely more than a sigh, her ear pressed almost to the wood to hear the tone. She learned by listening. She heard a student struggle with a tricky passage from a Mendelssohn concerto for the 100th time, and her fingers itched to show them the turn of the wrist that would make it sing. She would find discarded sheet music in the trash, imperfect copies the maestro had thrown away, and she would smooth them out under the lamplight in her room, deciphering the language of dots and lines as if it were a thrilling novel. One cool autumn evening, her secret world and the maestro's collided. She was in the salon, giving the piano one last careful wipe with a special cloth. The maestro had been working late, and he had stormed out earlier, leaving a storm of scattered papers on the music stand. It was a mess, and her mother would fret if it was left. Gently, Elena began to gather them. It was a score for a violin concerto, one she recognized from the frustrated yells that had echoed from the room earlier. The student, a young man with more title than talent, had been butchering it. As she ordered the pages, her eyes scanned the notes, and she saw it. A mistake. Not in the student's playing, but on the page itself. In the margin, the maestro had written an alternate fingering for a brutal run of notes, a shortcut he was trying to teach. But Elena, from her hours of silent practice, knew this shortcut would force an awkward position, making the next phrase almost impossible to play in tune. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, she picked up a pencil that had rolled under the stand. She drew a tiny, feather-light line, suggesting a different finger pattern. It was a simple, elegant solution, the kind that comes not from textbooks, but from feeling the music in your bones. The floorboard creaked. She dropped the pencil as if it were on fire. The maestro stood in the doorway, his overcoat still on, his eyes like two chips of flint. He had returned for something he'd forgotten. What? He said, the word cold and flat. Are you doing? Elena's voice vanished. She clutched the dusting rag, her knuckles white. He strode across the room, his gaze moving from her terrified face to the open score on the piano. He saw the pencil. He saw the faint, new mark on his precious manuscript. His face, already severe, darkened like a thunderhead. You asterisk marked asterisk this? He snatched the paper up, holding it close to his eyes. He saw her suggestion. For a long, terrible moment, he was silent, studying it. Elena felt a wild, impossible hope flutter in her chest. He would see the intelligence of it. He would understand. The maestro lowered the paper. He didn't look at the mark, but at her. His look was not one of anger, but of pure, undiluted contempt. It was worse than shouting. "You ignorant little thing," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You think because you creep around this house, because you hear the echoes of greatness, that you comprehend it? This," he tapped the paper violently, "is a language you will never speak. You have defiled this score with your grubby little presumption." He ripped the page in two, the sound horrifically loud in the silent room. "Your hands are made for scrubbing floors, not for interpreting art. Remember your place. It is asterisk there asterisk." He pointed to the rag in her hand. "Not here. If I ever see you near an instrument, or a score, again, you and your mother will be seeking employment in the gutter. Do you understand?" Elena could only nod, hot tears of shame blurring her vision. She wasn't crying from the threat, but from the utter annihilation of that small, hopeful part of her that had dared to speak the language she loved. "Now get out," he hissed, "and send your mother to me." Elena fled. That night, lying stiffly in her bed, she heard the low, urgent murmur of her mother's voice from the other side of their thin door. She was speaking to the maestro, her tone pleading and respectful. When her mother finally came to bed, she didn't scold. She simply got under the covers and held Elena's hand tightly in the dark. "We must be like mice now," her mother whispered, her voice tired and sad. "No more music, my heart. Not even a sigh." Elena stared into the darkness. The silence around her felt heavier than ever before, a thick blanket smothering the song inside her. She was a ghost in the temple of sound, and the high priest had just forbidden her very breath. The air in the von Gartner mansion grew thick with anticipation. As the night of the annual soiree arrived, for weeks, the house had been in a state of scrubbed and polished frenzy. Every surface gleamed. The grand salon was transformed, with extra chairs arranged in perfect rows and the great chandelier overhead lit with what seemed like 1,000 candles, throwing diamonds of light across the room. Elena and her mother worked harder than ever. It was their busiest night, a whirlwind of last-minute tasks performed in the shadows, while the glittering world prepared itself. They carried trays of polished glasses, adjusted flower arrangements, and ensured every corner was perfect. Elena moved through it all like a quiet spirit, the memory of the maestro's words a constant, cold stone in her stomach. She kept her eyes down, especially when she had to enter the music room, which now felt like a forbidden chapel. The star of the evening was to be the maestro's newest protege, a young baron. He was a tall, proud-looking young man who had been practicing the same fiery violin concerto for months. The maestro spoke of him to his guests in lofty tones, calling him the next great voice of our time. From her hidden listening posts, Elena had heard his practice. He was technically good, very good even, but there was a coldness to his playing, a feeling that he was performing mathematical equations, not telling a story. Still, the maestro had pinned his reputation for the evening on this young man's success. Backstage, in the small, cramped room off the salon where the performers waited, a different kind of tension was building. Elena was sent there with a pitcher of water and glasses on a tray. She slipped in quietly, placed the tray on a side table, and was about to leave when she saw the young baron. He looked like a different person. Gone was the proud posture. He was pacing like a caged animal, his face pale and slick with sweat. He kept wiping his hands on his fine trousers, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I cannot, he was muttering to himself, over and over. The maestro was there, his back to the door, his voice a low, impatient growl. Nonsense. It is merely nerves. Every great artist faces them. Breathe, think of the triumph. It is not nerves, the young man burst out, his voice cracking. It is my stomach. It is turning itself inside out. I feel terrible, as if to prove his point. He suddenly clutched his middle, his face turning a strange greenish shade. He stumbled towards a corner, looking desperately for a basin. Panic, cold and immediate, flashed in the maestro's eyes. He could hear the murmur of the audience, 100 of Vienna's most influential citizens, critics, and patrons settling into their seats in the next room. The performance was minutes away. Get hold of yourself, the maestro commanded, but his voice had lost its surety. It was edged with fear. Just then, the door opened and Elena's mother entered, Carrying an extra box of candles, she took in the scene instantly. The terrified young man, the furious maestro, the heavy cloud of dread. Her eyes met her daughter's for a second, wide with shared understanding. Disaster was here. The young baron made a terrible, retching sound. He was going to be sick. There was no way he could play. He stumbled past the maestro and out another door. One hand clamped over his mouth. For a moment, there was only silence in the little room, broken by the distant, polite cough of the waiting audience. The maestro stood perfectly still, his face ashen. His entire evening, his social standing, his moment of triumph, it was crumbling to dust. He seemed to shrink inside his perfectly tailored coat. Elena's mother moved first. She put down the candles and went to the maestro's side. Her voice was barely a whisper, meant only for him and her daughter. "Sir, there may be a solution." He turned to her, his gaze blank, as if seeing a stranger. "Solution? What solution? I have no other student prepared for this concerto. It is a complex, professional piece." Her mother took a small, sharp breath. It was the bravest thing Elena had ever seen her do. She glanced at Elena, who stood frozen by the door, then back at the maestro. "Elena knows it, sir. She can play it." The words hung in the air. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the maestro's shock broke, not into consideration, but into a kind of disbelieving scorn. He looked from the mother to the daughter, standing there in her simple, dark servant's dress. A low, humorless laugh escaped him. "Have you lost your senses? Your daughter? The girl who scribbles on my music. You think that because she creeps about this house, because she hears real music, that she can make it." His voice rose, dripping with sarcasm. "This is a concerto for a master, not a parlor tune for a scullery maid to hum while she scrubs pots." Elena felt the words like physical blows. She wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Her mother, however, did not flinch. Her back was still straight. "I have heard her, sir, late at night. She has a gift. Please, just let her try." "Try?" The maestro spat. "On my stage, in front of them asterisk." He gestured violently towards the salon. "It would be the final humiliation. They would laugh me out of Vienna." From the main hall, the sound of impatient applause began. It was a gentle, expectant ripple. They were waiting. The maestro was trapped. He saw it now. The utter ruin of sending no one out there, of announcing the baron's illness. It would be a different kind of laughter, but laughter all the same. He was a man presented with two poisons. His eyes, wild and calculating, landed on Elena again. A terrible, cruel idea seemed to form in his mind. If he had to be humiliated, perhaps he could control it. Perhaps he could make the girl the object of the joke, a distraction from his own failure. A nasty, resigned smile touched his lips. "Very well," he said, the words cold and heavy. "Let us give them their comedy." He strode to a locked cabinet on the wall, fumbled with a key, and opened it. From within, he lifted his most precious possession, the Stradivarius violin. It lay in its case like a sleeping legend, its wood glowing even in the dim light. He handled it not with reverence now, but with a grim purpose. He carried it over to Elena and thrust the open case at her. "You want to play music? Play. Use this. Let us all hear the magnificent talent that has been hiding among my dust rags." Elena stared at the instrument. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. To touch it felt like a sacrilege, even more so now. "Go on," he sneered. "Take it. Or is your courage as small as your station?" Her mother gave her the tiniest nod. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a fierce, burning pride. It was that look that untethered Elena. From her terror with trembling hands, she reached out and lifted the Stradivarius from its velvet bed. It was lighter than she expected, and it seemed to hum with a silent energy against her fingers. She took the bow, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the audience could hear it. The maestro leaned close, his final words a poisonous whisper meant for her alone. "Walk out there. Play your little tune. Make your noise. When they laugh, when they see the joke, take your bow and scurry off. You will be a brief, amusing disaster, and tomorrow, you and your mother will be gone from my house." He turned and opened the door to the stage. The light from the salon flooded in, bright and terrifying. The polite applause grew slightly louder, urging the performer to appear. Elena, holding a fortune in wood and string, wearing her servant's dress, stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding light. The light from the grand salon was like walking into the sun. It was a wall of brightness, of shimmering gowns and the black and white of formal suits, of 100 curious faces all turning at once towards the stage door. A murmur, confused and low, rippled through the audience as Elena appeared, This was not the tall, proud young baron they were expecting. This was a girl, slight and pale, drowning in the vast space of the stage. Her simple dark dress, so clean and neat in the kitchen corridors, looked shockingly plain against the rich velvet of the curtains. She clutched the magnificent violin as if it were a log she was afraid might float away. From his place in the wings, half hidden by shadow, the maestro watched. A cold, tight smile was fixed on his lips. This was his plan now. Let them see the joke. Let the contrast between the priceless instrument and the humble girl be so absurd that it would overshadow his student's failure. He saw the confusion on the faces of his peers, the raised eyebrows, the slight tilting of heads. Good, let them be puzzled. The laughter would come soon enough. Elena felt their eyes. It was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She could make out individual faces now, a woman with a diamond necklace glittering at her throat, a man with a monocle peering at her, a famous critic she recognized from the newspapers, his expression bored already. The grand piano loomed behind her like a dark mountain. The expectant silence was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Her fingers, curled around the neck of the Stradivarius, were frozen. Her knees felt like they might buckle. The memory of the maestro's last words hissed in her ear. Asterisk, when they laugh, scurry off, asterisk. She wanted to. Oh, how she wanted to turn and run back into the safe, dark silence of the servants' hall. But then, as if pulled by a string, her gaze found the very back of the hall. There, standing by the closed doors, away from the seated guests, was a figure in a plain dress. Her mother. She was not allowed in the salon during performances, but she had found a spot. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't nodding. She was just asterisk there, asterisk, solid as a stone in a river. Her eyes held Elena's across the impossible distance, and in them was no expectation of triumph, only a simple, unwavering message. Asterisk, I am here. Asterisk, something inside Elena clicked. The panic did not vanish, but it changed. It melted and reformed into a strange, clear calm. This was not about the audience anymore. It was not about the maestro and his cruel game. It was about the woman who had given her a violin instead of new shoes. It was about 1,000 silent hours of practice, of love poured into an old, worn-out instrument. This was her only chance, her one and only moment, to speak in the language she loved. Even if they laughed, she would have spoken truly. Just once, she closed her eyes. The world shrank. The rustle of silk, the smell of perfume and candle wax, the weight of their stares, it all faded away. She saw only the dark behind her eyelids. She felt the familiar curve of a violin under her chin, though this one was smoother, more alive. She felt the bow in her right hand, a perfect balance. She thought not of the notes on the page, but of the feeling of the music. The concerto began with a cry, a single, long, yearning note from the solo violin. It was a sound of loneliness, of something beautiful trapped and trying to be heard. She took a breath, deep and quiet. She raised the bow. In the wings, the maestro's smirk deepened. This was the pause before the fall, the awkward dithering of an amateur. Any second now, she would produce a scratch, a squeak, the pathetic noise of someone in over their head. Elena brought the bow down. The note that came from the Stradivarius was not a scratch. It was not a squeak. It was not even simply a sound. It was a asterisk presence asterisk. It was a pure, clear, solid beam of tone that seemed to hang in the air of the great room, perfect and unwavering. It was an A so true it vibrated in the teeth of the listeners. It didn't just enter their ears. It filled the space around them, stilling the very air. It was a note with no fear in it, no hesitation, only a profound and aching certainty. The effect was instant and total. The woman with the diamond necklace froze, her glass halfway to her lips. The man with the monocle blinked, his head tilting not in confusion now, but in stunned attention. The critic's bored look vanished, replaced by sharp focus. A gentleman who had been quietly whispering to his neighbor fell silent mid-word, his mouth still open. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. The rustling stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. The first note hung, sustained by Elena's perfectly steady bow arm, and then it began to sing. It tapered, swelled, and then flowed seamlessly into the next phrase, the beginning of the concerto's passionate first movement. But it was not the concerto as the young baron played it, all flashy technique and cold precision. This was different. The notes were the same, but the soul inside them was entirely new. The maestro, in the shadows, felt his heart lurch violently against his ribs. The cold smile melted from his face like wax under a flame. His professional ear, trained over a lifetime, heard the impossible. The intonation was flawless, not just correct, but alive. The bow control was masterful, producing a tone from the Stradivarius so rich and complex he had never quite managed to pull it from the instrument himself. But it was more than technique. It was the emotion, raw and unvarnished, that poured from the strings. He heard the loneliness of that first note bloom into a fierce, desperate longing. He heard a story in the music he had taught for years, but never truly understood. This was not a student playing a piece. This was a heart using a violin to speak its history. He saw the girl on the stage, her eyes still closed, her body moving not with theatrical sweeps, but with the natural, slight sway of someone completely lost in the world she was creating. She and the violin were one thing. His plan, his joke, his pathetic attempt to control the disaster, it all crumbled to dust. In the face of this undeniable beauty, a wave of heat rushed up his neck. It was shame, but a kind of shame he had never known. It was the shame of a man who has spent his life polishing a diamond and never once saw the light inside it, only to have a stranger walk in and hold it up to the sun. He had called her ignorant. He had mocked her gift. He had thrown the greatest instrument she would ever touch at her like a bone to a dog, expecting a whimper, and she had answered with a voice of pure gold. He leaned against the wall, suddenly weak. The sound filled him, and for the first time in decades, Maestro Edward von Gardner, the arbiter of taste, the scourge of the mediocre, listened not as a judge, but as a man being shown something miraculous. And he knew, with a sinking, awestruck certainty, that he was witnessing not the end of his reputation, but the birth of a legend he had tried with all his might to crush. The hall was frozen, yes, but it was frozen in reverence, not ridicule, and he was frozen with them, a prisoner of the beautiful, heartbreaking sound pouring from the stage. The music didn't just fill the hall, it changed the air itself. The opening cry had been a shock, but what followed held everyone in a kind of gentle, unbreakable spell. Elena played, and the concerto was no longer a test of skill, a mountain to be conquered by a talented young man. Under her hands, it became a story. Her story. She played the fast, technical passages not just with breathtaking speed and clarity, but with a fierce joy. It was the joy of a bird finally released from a cage, beating its wings against a stormy sky. The notes flew from her violin like sparks from a fire, each one precise and bright. The audience, many of whom knew this piece well, leaned forward. They had never heard it sound like this. It was alive. Then the music would slow, turning tender and aching. Here, Elena's playing softened, became a whisper full of sorrow. This was the sound of silent evenings, of watching a beautiful world from a dark corner. It was the memory of her mother's tired hands, of dreams practiced in total silence. A few of the women in the audience felt their eyes grow damp without quite knowing why. They heard a loneliness that spoke to something deep inside them, a feeling no fancy gown could cover up. She played with her eyes closed, her face pale and serious in the stage lights. She wasn't performing for them. She was somewhere else entirely. Her body moved with the music in a simple, honest way, a slight sway, a dip of her shoulder. It was the opposite of the proud, theatrical gestures the Maestro students were taught. This was the music moving through her, using her to find its voice. In the wings, the Maestro had not moved. The anger and scorn had drained from his body, leaving behind a hollow, shaking feeling. He was a master. He could hear things others missed, the subtle shift of weight in a bow stroke, the perfect vibrato on a long note, the intelligent phrasing that made even the most familiar melody sound new. This girl, this maid's daughter he had ridiculed, was doing all of it. Not just doing it, but doing it with a depth of feeling that terrified him. He thought of his own journey, years of grueling study, of competing, of building a name. Music had been a battlefield for him, a way to prove he was the best. He listened to her, and he realized with a sickening jolt that for her, music was a home. It was the only place where she was truly free. All his life, he had been shouting about music from a mountaintop. She was singing its truth from the heart of the valley. A memory sliced through him, sharp and unwelcome. It was of Elena's mother, just a week before, speaking to him in a quiet voice in his study. She had asked, ever so humbly, if there might be any work, any task at all, that could pay for a single proper lesson for her daughter from one of his junior instructors. He had waved her away, irritated. "My teachers are for serious students, not for servant girls with a passing fancy," he had said. The look on her face had not been anger, but a deep, resigned sadness. He saw that look now in his mind's eye, and it burned him. On stage, Elena reached the concerto's slow movement. It was a long, singing melody, a lament. Under her bow, it became unbearably beautiful. It was the sound of love that asks for nothing in return. It was the sound of her mother's constant, quiet presence. In the back of the hall, her mother stood with a hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a pain so proud it had to overflow. Every note was a piece of their life together, the struggles, the small joys, the silent understanding. The audience heard a masterpiece. Her mother heard her daughter's heart. No one coughed. No one whispered. A man who had come to the soiree board, expecting a pleasant but predictable evening, found his throat tight. He glanced at his wife and saw she was crying too. They didn't understand what was happening, only that something real, something more important than the crystal or the champagne, was happening in front of them. The final movement began, a lively, dancing rondo. It should have been triumphant, but in Elena's hands it became something else, a defiant hope. It was the sound of spirit that no amount of polishing floors could wear down. She played the difficult runs not as obstacles to show off, but as expressions of a wild, unstoppable energy. Her bow flew across the strings. The violin sang, laughed, and wept all at once. The maestro, watching her, finally understood the mark she had made on his score. It wasn't ignorance. It was a better solution, a simpler, more elegant path through the music that came not from a textbook, but from a body that knew the instrument as an extension of itself. He had been teaching the map. She knew the territory. The final notes came, not as a loud, showy bang, but with a breathtaking control. They were soft, precise, and then they were a whisper, and then they were silence. Elena lowered the bow. She let the violin fall gently from her chin. She opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a deep sleep. The bright lights, the sea of faces, it all rushed back in. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. No sound at all. The silence was thicker than the music had been. It was a held breath. Elena stood, small and alone, waiting for the laughter, for the cheers, for the sound of the maestro's angry footsteps coming to take the violin and send her away. Then, at the back of the hall, one person began to clap. It was not a polite patter. It was a firm, solid, steady sound. Her mother, her face still wet, was applauding as if her life depended on it. She was looking only at her daughter. It was like a dam breaking. A gentleman in the front row surged to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. Then another, then a whole row. The applause exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was cheering. People were shouting brava. Faces that had looked bored or scornful minutes before were now alive with excitement and wonder. They had not just heard a performance. They had witnessed a moment they would tell their grandchildren about. Elena swayed on her feet, dizzy from the shock of it. The noise was a physical wave beating against her. She searched the crowd and found her mother again, now smiling through her tears, clapping with all her might. And then she looked to the wings. The maestro was still there. He was not clapping. He was just staring at her, his face a mask of what looked like pain and awe all mixed together. The applause washed over him, but he seemed not to hear it. He was looking at Elena, really looking at her. For the very first time, he saw the girl in the simple dress, holding a violin worth a fortune, standing in the center of a storm of adoration she had never asked for. He saw the truth he had been too blind, too proud, to see. He took a step, then another, out of the shadows and onto the bright stage. The crowd, seeing him, began to quiet down, curious. What would the great maestro say? Would he claim credit for this astonishing discovery? He walked to the center, standing beside Elena. He did not look at the audience. He looked only at her, his eyes glittering with an emotion no one could name. Then, slowly, he turned to face the people. The room fell completely silent, waiting for his words. The silence in the hall was heavy, expectant. All eyes were on the maestro, standing beside the girl in the simple dress. They waited for the polished speech, the proud introduction of a secret pupil, a claim to this miracle. The maestro opened his mouth, but for a second, no sound came out. He looked old under the lights, the lines on his face deep. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, not with its usual commanding tone, but with something raw. He did not address the crowd first. He turned slightly, his words meant for Elena, though everyone could hear. "You asked me once," he began, the memory seeming to physically hurt him. "If you could learn the language of this music." Elena, still trembling, her mind a blur of sound and light, could only stare at him. "I told you it was not for you," he continued, each word seeming to cost him. "I told you that you defiled it with your presumption. He paused, swallowing hard. He looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his friends, his rivals, the city's elite. Tonight, you did not speak that language. He let the words hang there. The crowd was utterly still, confused. You did not speak it, he repeated, his voice growing stronger, filled with a terrible wonder. You sang it, with a voice I have spent my whole life trying to find, and never could. He turned fully to face the people now, his back straightening not with pride, but with a new, fragile honesty. Ladies and gentlemen, you came to hear a student. You heard, instead, a master. I was not her teacher. Tonight, I have been her student, and she has taught me that music does not live in the ink on a page, or in the price of an instrument. He looked at the Stradivarius in Elena's hand. It lives in the silence between heartbeats. And she found it there. He did not applaud her. He did not pat her shoulder. Instead, he did something that sent a shock through the room. He gave her a small, deep nod. It was the gesture of one artist acknowledging another. It was a surrender. The applause that followed was different from the first explosion. It was slower, deeper, understanding dawning on the faces in the crowd. They were applauding not just the performance, but the moment, the truth of it. Elena felt like she was floating. The noise, the lights, the maestro's words, it was all too much. A well-dressed man with kind eyes, a famous concert promoter, was suddenly at the edge of the stage, talking urgently to the maestro, gesturing towards Elena. A baroness in pearls was waving a fan, calling for the girl to come closer. The world was rushing in, fast and loud. A tidal wave of attention she had never dreamed of and did not want. Her eyes, wide and seeking an anchor, found her mother. Her mother was making her way through the crowd, not rushing, but moving with a quiet determination. People stepped aside for her, some with new respect, some with lingering confusion. She reached the edge of the stage and simply held out a hand. It was all Elena needed. She carefully placed the precious Stradivarius back into its case, her fingers lingering for a last second on the wood. Then she took her mother's hand. She didn't bow to the cheering audience. She simply stepped down from the stage, away from the lights, and let her mother lead her from the salon, through the familiar servant's door, and into the quiet, dark hallway beyond. The sound of the applause was muffled, then gone. They were home, in their own world of stone floors and simple walls. They didn't speak. They walked to their small room and closed the door. The silence there was a living thing, warm and safe. Finally, her mother let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at Elena, her eyes still shining. Your hands are shaking, she whispered. Elena looked down at her own hands. They were. So are yours, she said, her voice a hoarse croak. And then they both began to cry, holding on to each other, laughing through the tears. It was a release of a lifetime of quiet tension, of hidden hope, of fear. They cried for all of it. Later, after the water had been splashed on faces and they sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the reality began to settle. A soft knock came at the door. It was the maestro. He looked uncomfortable standing in the low doorway of the servants' quarters. May I? He asked, his voice quiet. Elena's mother nodded, her protective arm still around her daughter's shoulders. He did not enter fully. He remained on the threshold, a man straddling two worlds. They wish to meet you. The promoter, Herr Vogel. He offers a contract for concerts in the big hall with an orchestra. He said it flatly, stating a fact. Then he looked at Elena. You do not have to see anyone tonight. You have given enough. Elena nodded, grateful. He hesitated, his eyes falling on the old, worn violin case peeking out from under the bed. That is your instrument? He asked. Yes, Elena said. May I? She nodded again. He came in, just a few steps, and picked up the old case. He opened it. He looked at the humble violin with its scratches and worn varnish. He did not touch it. He simply looked for a long time. Then he closed the case with a gentle click. This, he said, his voice thick, is the violin that just shook my house to its foundations. He placed it back carefully. I will tell them you are resting. We will speak tomorrow. All of us. After he left, the silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence. It was full of a future that had just crashed into their present. What happens now? Elena whispered, the enormity of it all pressing down on her. Her mother took her hand. Now, she said firmly, you choose. That is a new thing. You did not have a choice before. Now you do. She smiled a tired, beautiful smile. But tonight, you sleep. And tomorrow, you will still be my daughter. And I will still be your mother. That does not change. The next days were a whirlwind. Herr Vogel, the promoter, came with papers and grand plans. The maestro, strangely subdued, sat in on the meetings, translating the complex terms into simple words, asking sharp questions on Elena's behalf that she would never have thought to ask. He was no longer a tyrant. He was a grim, efficient guardian, ensuring the vultures did not pick the gift clean. Offers came, for teaching, for endorsements, for a finer violin, for a new wardrobe, for a room in a better part of the city. Elena listened, but her choices, in the end, were simple and born of her own heart. She accepted Herr Vogel's guidance, but only if her mother was with her always. She accepted the chance to play with an orchestra, a dream so big it made her dizzy, but she refused to leave the maestro's house. "It is my home," she said simply. Not the grand salon, but the back corridors, the small room, the world she knew. The maestro, hearing this, proposed something himself. He would convert his sunlit garden room into a proper practice studio for her. He would, if she allowed it, become her advisor, not her teacher, he insisted. He had nothing left to teach her about feeling, but he could teach her about the world of music, about navigating its politics and its pitfalls. "You have the soul," he said. "Let me help guard it." One evening, a week after the soiree, Elena found herself alone in the grand salon. It was dark, lit only by moonlight through the tall windows. On the piano lay the contract, signed. On a chair sat the gleaming Stradivarius in its opened case, offered to her on permanent loan. She looked at them, these symbols of a new life. Then she walked to the corner and picked up her old case. She took out her own violin. She stood in the moonlight, in the silent, empty hall where her life had changed, and she played. Not a concerto, a simple folk tune her mother used to hum while mending clothes. It was a quiet, grateful sound, a thank you and a promise. The music floated through the dark house. In his study, the maestro heard it and put down his pen, listening with his eyes closed. In their room, her mother heard it and smiled. The familiar melody a balm. Elena played, connected to everything that had brought her here. The future was a strange and open road, but the song, she knew, would always be her own. It had been with her in the silence, and it would be with her in the noise to come. It was the one thing no contract, no applause, no maestro could ever give her, or ever take away.